We're facing an ecological disaster. We gather up the corpses and then... Why are so few bees being born? Without bees, men will have no fruit and vegetables. Why don't the bees return to their hives?
We had problems. We lost 45% of our bees.
I lost about 70% of my colonies.
Between October and December, I lost 90% of my colonies. Today, humanity is in danger. It's a planetary crisis. For 20 years, beekeepers have been faced with high levels of bee mortality. One fine morning, they find their hives empty of workers, and sometimes a carpet of corpses. However, since November 2006, the hecatomb has grown to such a proportion that in entire regions of North America, Europe, and Asia, the trees are no longer giving fruit, since they've not been pollinated. This disappearance affects both domesticated bees and wild species alike. Who is responsible? What is responsible for these thousands of deaths? There's not a single bee. You ask yourself, you say, what have I done? I'm the biggest fool. I'm a complete idiot. I'm an imbecile. What happened? You look no further, you tell yourself, it's my fault. That's all. It's me. What have I done to make them go? This is why very few people admit that they've lost their hives. You know perfectly well that they've all lost hives. Some have lost many, but no one will admit it. Because in any case, you aren't going to be reimbursed. There's no insurance to cover the loss of stock. So there's no point in looking like a fool in front of your colleagues.
At
the moment, we just have a few suppositions, and we're trying to verify them to explain the deaths of colonies that we've observed. We're mainly looking at bee diseases, and it's true, we know a lot about the Varroa mite, because we presume it's a big problem. Probably Varroa is not the only cause of these deaths, but we are convinced it plays a central role. Varroa destructor is the first suspect that came to the minds of beekeepers and scientists. A 2-millimeter-long mite that arrived in the 1980s with queen bees imported from Asia. A sort of tick that pierces the bee's body to suck out its hemolymph, the blood of insects. There's a bit of honey, but it's a little early. I don't think that Varroa is a major problem. What I mean is, when you have a strong colony, the bees manage to handle the Varroa population. In fact, you find very few. However, if the colony is weak, for whatever reason, the Varroa is an opportunist, and then it invades the colony completely. You can see it clearly, in fact. You see Varroa on a great number of bees, and then you have to treat. To treat Varroa, the only products authorized by veterinary services are chemicals. The disadvantage of these substances is that they accumulate in the wax that contains the honey, and each new dose is added to the preceding ones. as Philippe Leconte, a beekeeper in the Marne area, explains. At present, for chemical treatment with Avipar, for example, we're obliged to double the treatment application period, so this does have an effect on the bees. But in fact, each time we take action against a pathogen, there are always side effects. There are no treatments that have no effects on organisms. Otherwise, they wouldn't be treatments. Other solutions exist, and everyone has their own recipe. André Combe has been inspired by the treatment his father used to keep ticks off his dogs. Eau de vie, fruit brandy, which doesn't leave a residue in the wax produced by the bee. He tested his treatment for 5 years before finding the right dosage.
Du Varroa sur celle-là, comme va la faire là?
Pas tellement. Il y en a eu l'année dernière, mais au printemps, il n'y en avait pas énormément.
Il faut absolument pas que l'eau
The eau de vie mustn't touch the bees.
Voilà, on peut y aller.
We can proceed.
30 cc.
30 cc of eau de vie at 90 degrees. I emphasize uncamfered, and we wait half an hour. You have to work very quickly since the eau de vie is very volatile.
Voilà, on referme.
Ah si, il y en a.
Ah si, il y en a.
Ah oui, il y en a. Ouais. Ah ouais, ouais. Ah oui, il y en a pas mal même. Hein.
Il y en a pas mal, hein.
Regarde ça, tout ça.
There are perhaps 100 or so.
Qu'est-ce que c'est qui fait proliférer?
What makes Varroa proliferate is the decreased immunity of the bee. The bee, since the beginning of time, it has had ticks. Since it exists, the bee has had ticks. There was a balance between the Varroa and the bee. Varroa has been in Europe for 20 years. A healthy hive will tolerate its presence. It's understood that the parasite is not, therefore, the cause of massive disappearances, but a consequence of the weakened state of the bees. But what has weakened them? The situation is complex. In natural settings, wild pollen and nectar gatherers, most of which are solitary, are also disappearing. At this stage of the investigation, the cause of these deaths remains a mystery. Unaware of the danger, the best friends of flowers continue to gather pollen and nectar. In this apiary, there were 20 hives. I've lost 17 hives. And I know why. My neighbor, when he put herbicide on his lavender, I said to him, when you do the treatment, call me. If you do it at midday, it doesn't matter. But if you do it in the morning, call me. Because what do bees do in the morning? They go looking for the dew. By 11 a.m., I had lost 17 hives. I went looking for him. I was boiling with hatred. Okay, I take back the word hatred because you told me I shouldn't use it because it hurts. But I went looking for him. I took him to the apiary, and I said to him, what did I tell you? When you treat in the morning, call me. I'll close the hives, the dew evaporates at 11 a.m., and I'll open the hives. We can do that. But none of my workers came back. They were killed by the herbicide, a carpet of bodies. Our second lead starts in the summer of 1997, engraved in beekeepers' memories as the summer when thousands of colonies died. The beekeepers see a link to seeds coded with a new generation of insecticides like Gaucho and Région. Over a 7-year period, French beekeepers lost 450,000 hives. The bee deaths we've been observing since 96-97 are due to a large extent to the massive use of certain pesticides in agriculture, and particularly to seed-coating substances that are neurotoxic, long-lived, and systemic, meaning that they penetrate into the interior of the plant and that the whole plant diffuses the substance. Jean-Charles Bouquet, Director General of the French Agrochemical Industry Association, represents phytopharmaceutical companies such as Bayer, BASF, and Monsanto. To explain the phenomenon of the disappearance of bees, several hypotheses have been put forward, including that of pesticides. But what I can tell you is that the pesticides authorized today, when the conditions for use are respected, present no risk to bees. Marc-Edouard Collin is a veterinarian and university researcher in agronomy, whose mission is to understand why bees, in certain cases, fail to return to the hive. He's studying the action of pesticides, comparing the behavior of bees on organically and conventionally grown crops. On this subject, we're still far from knowing everything, knowing how the toxicity will be expressed, and most importantly, how it will be expressed when the exposure to toxic substances lasts a long time. And I believe that this is the current problem. Compared with former years, the exposure to bees to toxic substances is much longer now with systemic insecticides than it was before, when a field would be treated from time to time because it was attacked by a pest. Xavier Roux is president of the Association for the Development of Professional Apiculture. He recalls one phytopharmaceutical treatment used on crops surrounding hives. It's a neurotoxin used to treat sunflower parasites, in which attacks the bee's nervous system. The bee can't find its way and dies in the sunflower field. Where the colonies were situated, there was nothing but sunflowers. At that period, there were no other flowers. There were 40 hectares of sunflowers around the colonies, and they didn't produce a gram of honey. Of 80 hives, already 50% of them were dead practically within the month that followed, and I'd lost 80–90% by the end of the winter. Certain pesticides, therefore, can have long-term effects, deaths up to 6 months after exposure, which makes it practically impossible to pinpoint the guilty molecule. In the chronic deaths in beekeeping, or the phenomenon of massive bee disappearances, in these instances, we've never found pesticides present in sufficient quantities to explain the mortality. Personally, I don't believe the Gaucho-Région theory. I think it plays a very marginal role. It might be important when you have hives that are totally weakened, but this is not what the results of the AFSA epidemiological investigation shows us. What the epidemiological study shows is that we live in a background of pollution. There are constantly traces of pollutants in hives, but this is not what kills the bees. I don't see how pesticides, which are capable of altering all ecosystems and practically all living organisms in ecosystems, could not have an effect on bees. Basically, that would mean that the bee is the only organism that is not affected by pesticides. And we've been able to show, for example, that when the pesticides are used alone in certain cases, it is possible that they don't induce any effects at all. But when they are used in combination, they induce an explosive effect that can cause very high mortalities in less than 24 hours. Mortalities of the type 95% of the population decimated in less than 24 hours. In the tests that are carried out, the potential cumulative effect, so to speak, of several products is also studied, which explains why today certain combinations, for example, are prohibited in the presence of bees. It's also been shown that certain fungicides with certain insecticides can change the behavior of bees by slowing down, so to speak, their ability to escape or fly. So these combinations are prohibited. Everyone agrees. Experiments have shown that pesticides are dangerous when mixed together. But this raises a question. Can these prohibited combinations be produced without the farmer's knowledge, in his fields, because of the persistence of the substances over time? These insecticides are very persistent, even very persistent in certain cases. To give you the order of magnitude, the time necessary for the concentration of insecticides in the soil to be halved, we thought at first, was 2 weeks, a month. In fact, it's more like 3 months, or perhaps even 6 months or a year. So the following year, there will still be the insecticide from last year's crop. And this persisting insecticide will of course be added to by the next dose applied the following year. To verify whether different chemical substances might accumulate in the soil, we asked a farmer to tell us what treatments he used on his crops. 15 or so fungicide treatments, after that a herbicide, and then 1 or 2 insecticide treatments per year. The schedule of phytosanitary treatments is just as eloquent. So here are the products that have been applied with the dose per hectare. This is an insecticide. It's very expensive. There must be others. There are 11, 18, 21, 29. That quickly becomes very expensive. In less than a year and throughout the growth period of a crop, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides are used one after another. The result is that in the soil and inside the plants are substances that are authorized and used correctly, but which produce combinations that are prohibited by the companies themselves. One of Norbert Maudois' special skills is raising queen bees. The queen differs from all other bees by her size and longevity. She alone is marked with the color of the year of her birth. Red means 2008. Once I was talking with an orchidist who had just poisoned the hives of a friend. They weren't mine. But I said to him, "Now what would happen if I came to your place and cut down half of your apple trees with a chainsaw?" And the orchidist, he looked at me and said, "Well, that's not very complicated. I'd take out my 12-gauge shotgun and blow your face off." That's exactly what he said. So I said, "That's just what you've done to the hives." And he looked at me dumbfounded. He just understood what was going on. I believe that more and more since we've begun to communicate on this subject, that farmers are starting to understand this problem and the phenomenon. The problem now is that there are also networks in market gardening and farming with technicians working for the phytosanitary companies who maintain a different discourse. So it's a bit like the earthenware pot against the iron pot. There are so many examples of intoxication that the question must be asked. Why would anyone authorize the use of 80,000 tons of pesticides in France each year? We decided to examine the procedure of approving these substances. All products used for plant treatments are subjected to the marketing authorization procedure. And in this marketing authorization, there are bee tests, which are mandatory. On the other hand, these bee tests were defined about 50 years ago, and they're no longer adapted to the modern insecticides used today. The flaw of the test is that at the present time we can't anticipate or even study an approval file for the possible effects that molecules receiving marketing approval might engender. I couldn't swear to the fact that I've never approved a product that presented a risk to bees. After all, we do have a few cases where, in all conscience, I've said that there was no risk to bees, and then afterwards it was discovered that there was a potential risk. And in these cases, the products have been withdrawn. The use of gaucho has been suspended for sunflower and maize. Now we discover that its little cousin, called Cruiser, which is from exactly the same family, has been approved for the national territory. I note that it's recently been suspended in Germany, following a certain number of problems with bees. So what we're witnessing, in fact, is the replacement of one active substance by another active substance that resembles it. Perhaps it'd be a good idea to get a general decision about a class of insecticides. That would save us a great deal of time. Pesticides are toxic at infinitesimal doses. And when they spare adult bees, The substances brought in with the pollen poison the larvae. The secondary effects of these products have not yet been revealed when a new generation of insecticides arrives on the market, those produced by the plants themselves, genetically modified plants. In France, this concerns maize for the most part. Okay, you can see it's balanced there. We have orange pollen from the sunflower, and then quite a few yellow balls, which are from maize. And there are about 150, 180 grams of pollen. So it's clear that the bee has been working on the maize. Do you analyze this pollen afterwards? Of course. This pollen will be sent to a specialized laboratory to see whether there is GM maize or not in the area where the hives were. You see, GMOs are something new. I'm living close to a farmer who's recently planted 100 hectares of GM maize. I'm not against GMOs in general. I'm against the Monsanto 810 maize, because this maize produces its own insecticide and in considerable amounts, which is more than the quantities that would be applied by the spraying methods we've been using up until now. Since February 2008, the growing of Monsanto 810 maize has been suspended in France, pending further examination. To get a clearer idea of the GMO question, we went to Germany to meet with the eminent Dr. Katz, renowned in particular for his work on the impact of GMOs on bees.
Well, in most cases, we found out that genetically modified plants have no effect on honeybees.
And yet, 3 years earlier, Dr. Katz had demonstrated that the foreign gene used to modify canola had transferred itself into a bacteria living in the intestines of bees, a transfer from a plant to an animal. The discourse today is amazingly toned down.
We really see that it is directed against Lepidoptera, so butterflies. And it looks like that other factors plus the toxin then affect the bees.
With research increasingly funded by industry, including the chemical industry, are scientists still free to publish the results of their studies?
Did you receive, I don't know, pressure from lobby on film not to?
Oh, sure, yes. Oh, yes, I did. I didn't expect that. I was kind of naive when I started with the studies and thought, okay, it's not that. I think it's not that exciting on the one hand, and so, but I got a lot of pressure. And so we're cooperating with a chemical company. And so some of the scientists and managers said, oh, it's okay to look at it. And others said, why we look at this crazy stuff anyway? So,
Some studies are disturbing, especially when they call into question patents on life. But this does not prevent Dr. Katz from having his own convictions regarding GMOs.
well, this is my very personal view, not the professional view on agriculture and GMO. I think we should increase or keep diversity, even in agricultural plants, high instead of just focusing on a few. And I think the possible problem in the future might be if we just only focus on a very few numbers and of different types on a certain plant.
GMOs or no GMOs, our countryside has been taken over by monoculture, a floral impoverishment that harms the bee, which needs a varied diet. So we have wheat, and more wheat, and practically nothing else. No other grass is tolerated, and obviously on the soil, if you look, no insects or practically none. Density zero, or very low. So it's truly a desert for pollinators. The fact that the countryside, in any case a good part of Europe, is dominated by intensive agriculture has a direct impact on bees and on wild pollinators in general. The land is fragmented. The natural environments are often reduced to tiny postage stamps on a wide matrix of intensive farming. If we compare this with the fields of wheat painted by the Impressionists a century ago, the fields were full of color, There were poppies, cornflowers, things like that. Plants that were visited by the pollinators. But today, the poor bumblebee that comes here will have to go elsewhere if he wants to eat. A hive containing 60,000 bees fertilizes 35 million flowers per day. Bernard Vassière and his team at the INRA in Avignon are the first to have measured the economic value of bee pollination, compared with the action of the wind and insects. It's important to measure the potential consequences of this decline of pollinators. And to measure that, we've developed a technique in the context of the alarm program which consists of evaluating the impact of insects as compared to wind pollination or passive self-pollination. Here we have a capitula with a hydrophilic plastic bag to measure pollination without wind or insects, passive self-pollination. Here we have a capitula and a gauze sachet that allows 75% of the atmospheric pollen to penetrate. The difference between the two gives us the impact of wind pollination, and then pollination by insects or free pollination. The difference between it and the two other capitulas will give us the impact of pollination by insects. The INRA has estimated that 80% of the world's plants would disappear without pollinators. For the agricultural sector, this represents a worldwide turnover of $153 billion. The bee is thus an ally to the world economy, a necessary condition for the harvest. Bees travel no further than 3 kilometers from their hives, and beekeepers move them in relation to the different flowering periods. This represents a veritable transhumance over hundreds of kilometers to collect pollen and nectar from hectares of apple trees, strawberry plants, and melon vines.
Stop. Descend. Descend.
In the past, beekeepers would pay to leave their hives near a field of lavender. Today, as the pollinators disappear, the farmers are calling the bees for help. Bruno Camus, professional apiarist, also rents his hives out to orchardists. It's true that pollination requires wide distribution of hives. You have to put 4 hives in one place, 6 in another. So we spread out our apiaries, which is not ideal for monitoring. And then you have to realize that you're always a little worried putting your hives in orchards, because you're at the mercy of a potential treatment and therefore of death. 9 times out of 10, it hasn't come from the orchardist who asked for the hives because he's perfectly aware and informed about the importance of bees. This is Bromberry honey. I really do have great faith in the fact that beekeepers and farmers work together. It's undeniable the role of bees in pollination. It's also undeniable that we beekeepers need, first of all, sites to place our hives. 9 times out of 10, it's the goodwill of a farmer who lends us a place. And then also partly because our bees work on the cultivated plants, and partly because they also work on non-cultivated plants. So we've seen that without bees, there's no fertilization of flowers and hence no fruit or vegetables. But pollination presents another advantage of prime importance. The transport of pollen from one flower to another contributes to genetic dispersion, a melting pot of plant genes. This is how, since the beginning of time, fruit and vegetable varieties have been able to evolve and remain strong and resistant to disease. This floral diversity is also essential for bees. At this stage of our inquiry, it seems that the health of bees depends on a varied, pesticide-free diet. Following the different German, Swiss, and French testimonies, We went to the United States to meet the people who've named this mysterious bee affliction colony collapse disorder, or CCD. David Hackenberg runs a professional pollination service. He has 2,000 hives that travel more than 5,000 kilometers a year.
Most of our beehives right now are in upstate New York producing a crop of honey. They just came back from pollinating blueberries in Maine. And we have a few beehives here today we're going to look at.
Here, the decline of wild pollinators is dramatic, and fruit and vegetable producers cannot expect good harvests without renting hives from beekeepers. If the mortality of domesticated bees continues, by 2012, there will not be enough pollinators in the United States.
If they all look like this, we'd be really happy. There are 50,000 bees in this hive. Good time of the year, you know, bees are doing fine and makes beekeepers happy. Although all the bees in the United States don't look like this right now. They're having problems. We already see some hives that are starting to come down with the problem, and we'll walk over here and show you some, show you what CCD looks like.
David Hackenberg is the first beekeeper in America to have alerted public authorities and scientists about the fatal decline of his colonies.
This hive here has got problems. It's breaking down with CCD. As you see, there's no populations here. The population never builds up. The bees disappear before they get to age. And they're not gathering any feed. I mean, they're not bringing any honey. They got a problem. I mean, that hive in another couple weeks may be dead, maybe gone. You ask yourself, what did you do wrong? But finally, I realized it's not what I did wrong, it's where I've been and where the environment of my bees have been in. And when you stop and really start thinking about it from that aspect, that it's not what you did, but it's something out here that you have no control over, then you kind of get angry because of the fact that somebody else out here, something else is affecting my livelihood, and there's nothing I can do to change it.
David Hackenberg and researcher Dennis van Engelstorp know each other very well. The beekeeper has entrusted his CCD-affected hives to the scientists, who's been studying them for over a year.
Uh-oh. And this bee right here, it's doing a dance. See? That dance is telling the other bees where to go and find some food. So there's not much in this colony at all. It's like it's weak, and old bees who collect food have all disappeared, and they're not collecting food, so these bees are hungry.
Research teams at the U.S. Ministry of Agriculture initially found an explanation: a virus.
We have found, in a lot of cases, CCD colonies have Israeli acute paralysis virus. This virus that is not from Israel, it was just a guy in Israel who found it first. And so we think that what happens is that bees get the flu.
Influenza. This virus was triumphantly announced in 2007 as being the cause of deaths in American bees, a single and ideal culprit that, under the authority of the microscope, annulled the other hypotheses. A virus. All that was necessary then was to find a cure. But Dr. Jeff Pettis revealed to us what they discovered when they pursued their investigations.
Yes. We've been looking at viruses as probably perhaps just a consequence of something else that's gone on in the colony. We know that honeybee viruses are always present, and under normal conditions, they don't cause a problem.
With the virus theory discarded, the researchers turned their interest towards a fungus, Nosema, known to infect the bee.
Nosema, which is a gut parasite of bees, is also on the rise in U.S. colonies, and we don't understand why.
Might the proliferation of Nosema be responsible for the abnormal mortality of bees in the USA?
Nosema is an interesting one because there is this new type of Nosema now, Nosema cerana. And we are finding, in fact, in some of these colonies, very high levels of Nosema cerana in the summer, which is unheard of. Usually we see Nosema in the fall. So this is a problem for many beekeepers, Nosema cerana. There is no question. But in CCD colonies, most of the colonies that have CCD, we cannot find any Nosema cerana when we look.
Neither the virus nor the Nosema theories can fully explain the sudden deaths of bee colonies. The American researchers are now looking at the impact of pesticides as well.
We also wanted to look at pesticides, both the pesticides that the beekeepers applied to control the mites and the pesticides that maybe the bees were bringing in from the farm, that farmers apply and bring it to the hive. We did find that there were high levels of pesticides in some cases, and certainly that can't be good for the bees, so it probably doesn't help. It's probably a problem in bees' health.
In the middle of apples, they sprayed a sail, which is a nicotinoid, a metacorporate product. They were told by the chemical companies, you can spray this stuff in the middle of apples because it's safe for honeybees. It don't kill adults. Well, I agree with them, it don't kill adults, but it's a sublethal dosage of this stuff that they bring back to the hive, feed to the young, and it becomes a birth defect.
In the U.S., we almost never look at interactions. At least we're not required to look at the interactions between two pesticides. So that's something that we're also beginning to try to understand, whether two pesticides together could be more harmful than either one of them alone. And also in combination with things like fungicides, which are often applied at the same time that a pesticide would be applied. So we don't require that testing go on to look at the interactions, but it's something that we're looking into as possibly contributing.
You visit the scientists here in the United States, they're going to tell you that we're finding 25 pesticides in the samples of pollen, 30-some fungicides, numerous herbicides, all in a little sample of pollen that big.
Same conclusion as in France. The pesticide mixtures produce effects that no one can control.
Most of the scientists here in the United States, off the record, you know, if they weren't talking to you on camera or talking to the news media, they're going to tell you that they're almost sure that the pesticide is the problem.
We don't want to just put out false warnings, so we don't want to say that we're worried about this compound or that compound without some really good evidence, because then the grower or the beekeeper becomes confused. You've told me this was a problem, this was a problem, this was a problem, and now you're telling me it's not a problem. So we want to be sure that we have good evidence before we talk about reasons for concern.
Coming from the researchers who in 2007 had proclaimed the existence of a link between the virus and the collapse of bee colonies, such caution about confirming the role of pesticides in the disappearance of bees is food for thought. Does the $33 billion market shared by a handful of agrochemical companies have anything to do with this caution?
Hey, how you doing?
Was not the virus theory ideal for a new pharmaceutical contract?
Looks like these pumpkins are getting ready for bees.
I see a couple flowers up here. I think if you can come Thursday, that'll be pretty good. If we can look at about 200 hives by the end of the week, that'll get us started, and another 200 in about 2 weeks.
We're going to go to New York here Monday and Tuesday and get them ready and get them down here. So we'll be in here probably Thursday night or Friday morning early. No, they just put a big bunch out. I forget what I saw. Male flower right here. Coming up. That's the one I saw, yeah.
I'll be darned, that's the first one I saw.
Yep. Coming along.
Thursday's going to be about perfect. We won't miss anything.
Yep.
If I had to count on wild bees for my pumpkin crop, I would not pay for the cost of planting and starting a crop. Pollination is so important. We need the extra bees in for hives, and the wild bees just aren't going to be able to handle that.
It may seem incredible, but wild bees are inexistent in the large crop-growing areas of America.
We've seen a dramatic increase in the cost of the bees because the beekeepers have to replenish their beehives. So we've seen an increase in price by twice as much as the previous year, and that was just in 1 year. I haven't changed a lot of my personal practices yet, If I can get some scientists to pinpoint some of the chemicals that are causing the damage, I will make those changes here on this farm.
But I said, I got enough problems. I just don't have time to screw around with you guys. If I probably had my best wishes for the bees, I probably wouldn't move bees to pumpkins. But the farmer's got to have bees. I have to have a paycheck to keep going. So sometimes we take bees in places where we know that's not good. So what we're doing is trying to help them get through it.
To keep in shape, a bee needs sugar obtained from the nectar of flowers and protein provided by pollen. However, pumpkins offer very little protein. To remedy this, American beekeepers, as in any industrial animal rearing activity, resort to mixtures that bear little resemblance to the insect's natural food.
To make our protein for our bees, we're starting out with sugar, brewer's yeast, dried eggs, canola oil, vitamins, and citric acid, and a few other little things, some honey. And we come up with this protein patty, which we started to feed to our bees last year, and it seems to be doing the job.
Faced with a decline of bees and lack of honey, humans tend to act irrationally, forgetting that the bee feeds on its own honey and the pollen it gathers.
It's all about money today. I mean, it's about how fast we can grow this crop, how good our lawn can look. And unfortunately, we have forgot about nature. I'm optimistic that something's going to happen, that eventually we're going to somehow prove that this is what I think it is. And the public's going to scream loud enough that the government makes the chemical companies pull this stuff off the market. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow because we're talking about lots of money here. I mean, we're talking about the biggest corporations in the world. And the way politics works in the United States is if you can pad somebody's pocket good enough, why, you can get done anything you want.
In France, when winter drags on too long, many beekeepers feed their bees sugar syrup or corn molasses, sometimes not free from chemical substances. However, in the Monoculture region, Pierre Brasque and his son Romain ensure that their bees have a stock of their own honey. It's necessary to add stocks so the bees can get through the winter. So the idea of honey as a dietary supplement, it's quite satisfactory. However, a sugar syrup could never replace honey, because in fact honey contains antibacterial substances, enzymes. Ideally, the colony should only consume its own stocks, what it has collected. Another black hole of knowledge concerns the electromagnetic waves that cover our environment in an invisible fog. Bees are able to locate their hives to within a millimeter thanks to a particle of magnetite in their abdomens. But what if the waves from the transmitters used by our mobile phones and computers disturbed their sense of orientation? Studies have been conducted, but they're frankly not conclusive. Researchers were trying to see an acute effect on these radio frequencies, the microwave effect. Was it capable of cooking bees or not? I'm summarizing a bit, simplifying, but no one looked at the long-term effects of these radio frequencies. I'm not saying it was radio frequencies, but it should have been looked at in another way. In the absence of serious research, it's difficult to measure the specific effect of pulsed waves, whose impact on the orientation of whales and human health is beginning to be realized. In natural settings far from big cities, these radio waves, pulsed to travel over several kilometers, might explain certain bee disappearances. In a farming area, at the base of a hive, Dr. Colin films the behavior of disorientated bees. Here's a bee that can still walk, but is no longer capable of really flying. It's completely lost all its landmarks. It doesn't go towards the hive. What's striking is that it doesn't fly straight. It makes little flights, but never really very straight. Goes off to the side. So this is really characteristic of an intoxication. Here it is immobile, completely immobile. So we would say, if we wanted to compare with what has been found in mammals, we could almost say that it's in a coma, and then, well, it will never return. So it's a lost worker. Here's another one. You can see it if you have a good look at the ground. If you get right down on the ground, then you can see that there are many bees walking that don't return to the hive, that don't collect nectar. So here the problem is that we can see the nervous system signs linked to intoxications. It's clear. Now going to the source of the intoxication is going to be much more difficult. We can of course look for a possible neurotoxin and maybe find one. But in certain cases, the doses that can kill an insect are so small that even the best analysts, the best chemists, will not be able to find a trace of this insecticide. The conclusion is clear. There are two forms of bee mortality. The first is a radical carpet of dead bees, and it may be due to the application of pesticides at times when the bees are gathering nectar and pollen. The second is a slow death in the field, without returning to the hive, and it may be explained by coated seeds or the invisible mixture of chemical treatments, those used by farmers and sometimes by beekeepers to control Varroa. Unpredictable and little studied effects. Confronted with the disappearance of the bee, scientists worry about the consequences for humans.
If you think about what we would eat if they had no bees at all to pollinate, you would only be able to eat corn, wheat, rice, and other wind-pollinated insects. A very good American example is if you have a Big Mac. The Big Mac, and you get rid of all the pollinators, you do not have the meat, you do not have the lettuce, you do not have the cucumber or tomato. You don't even have the sesame seeds on the bun. All you have is the bread.
Naturalists are accustomed to saying that nature is strong and that insects are particularly resistant to attack. We hope that bees will resist. What about humans? On the human side, we're starting to get a very good idea of the diseases induced by pesticides. We can observe the midterm effects between 6 months and 3 to 5 years after exposure, and we find disturbances of vision, behavior, concentration, and orientation. We find paralyses as well. We find problems of sensation at the cuteness level, that is in the skin, and many other effects similar to those observed in soldiers exposed to chemical weapons during the Gulf War. We now know that almost certainly pesticides are the cause of a certain number of cancers, lymphomas in adults, leukemia in adults, but also brain tumors in children and adults. The anxiety of farmers faced with crop-ravaging pests and their recourse to chemicals are understandable. However, without bees, they're ruined. Awareness of the danger is beginning to reach the countryside. It would be ideal if public authorities heeded this warning too and ceased their eradication of plants along railway lines, roads, and footpaths. Several municipalities in France have already implemented a pesticide-free policy. And this same lucidity applies to private gardens. The survival of pollen and nectar gatherers is in the hands of us all. In Sarouge, they know that looking after bees rhymes with looking after humans. Bees are dying through human activity, in particular the use of pesticides. We can no longer feign ignorance and pretend that we didn't know. Bees are just one more item on the list of the thousands of living organisms that we've already made disappear from the Earth.
Oh là, ça c'est une merveille.
Bees are quite simply one species too many. Their disappearance could ring the death knell for humanity.
Viens faire la belle, viens.
Let us have the humility to heed the message sent by the millions of collapsing bee colonies, and the wisdom to do something about it.